I come here as part of the No Cam and one of the spokespersons for the No campaign. If people know that in the beginning of this, going back to 2014, I think 2016, up until that period of time, I was a supporter of the Yes voice, and that I actually wrote articles about it in the Fin Review and the Australian, and also with the Uphold and Recognise, which is a conservative group that supports the Yes campaign, such as Julian, Lisa and people like that. But first of all, I've got to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and also the welcome that we got today from Julie Coombs, and I thank her for that generosity of that welcome as well. I also like to say, gee, that was a bit of a passionate case there, I've got to say, Jill, and that was great to hear you come out and prosecute that case, because one of the most important things, one of the things I do worry about in this campaign, and we've seen it over the last few weeks, some of the vitriolic and some of the fights that are coming out, and it's great to share a platform with Jill where we can put our cases out there. You can, ask us questions, and then we'll try and answer them, and then you will go away and you will vote the way you think you should vote. And that's the right way of doing things, and that's the right way about democracy. As usual, make up your mind. I hope you take the no case on side, but if you vote yes, at least you heard both sides. Okay? And we've got to keep that mature, sensible approach to that. And I'd like to thank Aaron too for inviting me along for this and getting us involved. Now, what I want to start off with is that photo. That photo, if you see the baby up in the right-hand corner or your left-hand side, that's my father. Don't worry about the time. I took the photo off my iPad, and that was the time I took the photo. And anyway, and the bloke who's holding him in his hands is my grandfather, and the woman to his left is my grandmother, and down here in the left-hand, your left-hand corner, but the little boy down in the corner is my Uncle Claude, and didn't fit all in, but there's a number of other children laying on the ground. My father is one of 12 children. He was born out on a cattle station out at Baryugal, up about 80 kilometres up the Clarence Valley, and in New South Wales, which Grafton and that sits on. And he is, and his community was worked in a Yugal Bar cattle station in Baryugal for since the 1830s. The 1830s is when white people come up to our country, and then it was an interesting thing. If you buy my book at a very reasonable price in a very good bookstore, you'll learn all about it. Anyway, so what I got up there, you see the women sitting in the front here. So this is like, for me, and this is why it's on my iPad and on my computer, it is looking back in history. Now that photo, we don't know what year my father was born, but it was around the 1816 to 1818 period, so that period of the late First World War, I should say. And so those women in the front would have been born, they're about 60-something years old. So you put that in context, they would have been born about the 1850s. So that photo to me tells a story going back about my family's survival and how they worked from the 1830s to come forward to where I am today. And I always when I turn my computer, I turn my iPad on, I look at that, and that takes me back. And I just wonder the life that those people living on those cattle stations and working on those cattle stations. And some of the older people that you see, that big bloke at the back there. My family's quite interesting because all our men and that women were about 6'2". My father was 6'3", and my mother was 4'11". They made an interesting couple, and of course my mother controlled everything in our house. And and where my ancestry comes from is because Bunjalung is my father's side, and the Gumbanga Yuan side is my mother's, which is the central New South Wales down to the south coast of New South Wales as well. Anyway, why I put that up there is it reminds me of why I'm in this debate and why am I doing these things. My family background is that after my grandfather was a very strong, hard-working drover, cattleman on the cattle stations, and my father grew up, and my family was all born out there. He's one of 12. My mum and dad had 11 kids. Can you imagine 10 others of me? Anyway, and Mundine's are very well known. Karen Mundine, who is I love to death, is an amazing, incredible woman, and also CEO of Reconciliation Australia, and what an amazing career and commitment to Aboriginal and to people and to Australia she has done. After the Second World War, prior to the Second World War, that period there, my family made a decision, and that decision was that they weren't going to become victims. They weren't going to become the fringe of society and that. So my mother's father actually, up around Kempsey, he is a sawmiller. He was a sawmiller in the 1810s, the 1820s, the 1830s and 40s. Had about 3 fingers. It's interesting, sawmillers always got fingers missing. And they were very hard-working, very strong people who were never, ever going to sit back and be second best in this country. So he bought a house. In fact, he brought a farm on that Nambucca Valley area and worked on that farm as well as working as a sawmiller. He was a Donovan. In our family we called them Donovans, which is interesting because when I went back to Ireland, because that's where the name come from, was Ireland, that they, in 2011, they actually called it Donovan over there. They were out of Western Cork, which probably means one of my ancestors killed Michael Collins, but anyway, that's another story. And they were very strong, hardy people, and they were not going to be pushed around. In fact, there's legends and stories of my grandfather, because they didn't live on a mission. They actually, the cattle station they lived on, and eventually the cattle station owners around the 1890s actually gave them the land. And so they had lived on their own land. Community of about 200 or 300 people, and they worked very hard from all the cattle stations from around Bayougal right up into Queensland, southwest Queensland. And because that gave them also a bit of independence, and this is why my thinking comes from, because there's a story going that the Welfare Office, because the first 13 years of my life I was born under the New South Wales Aboriginal Act, and I was also born under the New South Wales Welfare Board, which, as Jill pointed out, had a lot of control over Aboriginals across our state, and it was pretty tough for Aboriginal people. But because we had that independence, there's a story goes that the police and there's 2 stories I'd like to tell you. One is about the police turning up to Bayougal and insisting that they can come into the Aboriginal the square, we used to call it, and my uncles and grandfather actually pulled a gun on them and hunted the police off. And when the police went back to Casino, they were to get other police to come back. The actual cattle station owners come around from that area because my family was well known for their work they did in the cattle stations, and supported them. And the police never come back. The other story is when after the Second World War, after my father came back from the war, he was determined, and my mum was determined to make sure that they were able to buy a house. So in 1947, they bought a house in South Grafton, which is, Aboriginals owning houses, and that in those days would have been as rare as hen's teeth. And he did it at a time when when under the Welfare Board Act, that he was only getting a 40% of what the white man working next to him. He was a grader up. He's a smart guy. He learned how to drive a grader during the war because he knew after the war that he needed a job. And he So the bloke sitting driving the grader next to him got $100, he got $40. And he knew that was not going to get him be able to buy a house. So he, and this is where my Labor Party side comes from, he joined the AW and they fought a case for him and they got him his full wages and they were able to buy a house in South Grafton. Very unusual. But it wasn't a great big house, it was 4 rooms, not 4 bedrooms. My mum and dad lived in one room, don't know why, they never had sex. And my parents and my sisters lived in the other room, and and there was a kitchen and a bathroom, then a toilet outside. Us boys, we slept on the veranda. In fact, you know, when we go back, my mum and dad lived in Humpies on the Man River, up at Jackadgery when they first got married, and 2 of our older siblings were born there. And then my grandparents also lived in Humpies as well, at Bayougal, because they wanted their independence and they didn't want to, and they wanted to do their own thing. The other, I grew up around that period, and then so we had, 13 people in a house. I know I'm in Victoria, so you probably won't understand the next thing. So, because it's rugby league, there's 13 players, so we worked at a footy team and what part, my mother was half back and everyone else and things like that. And we had a pretty interesting life, because in those days you weren't allowed to get to public schools, and so we all went to a Catholic schools. The Catholics, you know, they took us in, and we grew up about that. And my father always taught us, never become a victim, always be strong, take responsibility for your life. And he was a very tall, proud man, 6'3", and he always walked around like his back was like that. And he was very well respected around the town because he was a typical thing. He was a great cricketer and played not a bad game of rugby league. And so that was sort of in our blood, and it was about who we were. That we weren't anything we did was good or bad, whatever. We were going to take responsibility for it and make a difference for ourselves. And then what happened from that period on, my parents, because they, like Jill's, they had a very limited education. They didn't get out of, I think it was 4th class as far as they went into bush. And, but I tell you what, they put us to shame because their handwriting, that was perfect, and their grammar was really incredible. I don't know what they used to do in school in those days. And they wanted us to be either fully educated, get a job, and go from there. And what happened was my older sister Anne, she started in the bank, working in the Rural Bank in New South Wales in 1960. A woman, an Aboriginal woman, working in that bank in 1960. She took that battle on. I'll go back a step to my mother. Once when we bought the house in South Grafton, the welfare board turned up, and you could just walk into your house and check it was clean, check the kids were clean. And my mum picked a broom up. It was one of my joys of a 7-year-old kid seeing this welfare officer being bashed around the head with a broom and hunted off, and he never come back. So we were strong, and we were going to not stand up to these things. But doesn't say things weren't bad. I saw my father strip searched by police when he was in town by 2 young police officers because they said to him, "You may be an Aboriginal, you may have a house, but as far as we're concerned, you're Abos." And that's how they treated, and even no matter how good you were like that. So that was a very strong upbringing for my family. My older sister Olive, second older sister Olive, she worked in the Rural Bank as well, and she, like a Hollywood movie thing, she was discovered by David Jones, and she'd become a model, and she was in all the popular newspapers and everything at the time in the 60s and late 60s and that. She then decided that she wanted to go back into the community and help the Aboriginal community, so she'd become a school teacher. And then she went to Canberra, and the Aboriginal Medical Service in Canberra has her name on the wall where she founded that and worked for that. So we've been fighters, and we've been fighters for Aboriginal rights for a very long time. I want to jump now to 1967 referendum. The 1967 referendum anniversary, 56 years, was yesterday. And it's an amazing, important referendum. because it did a number of things. Some of it was boring legal stuff, and people don't quite understand what it did, was when Aboriginals weren't allowed to be counted in the census. And we needed to have that in there, so then you could look at, because as you know from the census, money is spent on services, and everything like that. People don't understand that it actually come from the Civil War, post-Civil War, and that was because the South refused to give voting rights even after the Civil War to African Americans. And so what the Constitution of the United States did, they changed it so you couldn't count African Americans in the census, because that meant if there was 1 million African Americans in your state, you could count them and get extra seats, even though they couldn't vote. And so it was really stacking by the southern states to get their, as they called them, the Dixiecrats, the Jim Crow people, into the federal parliament, into the Congress. So that was why it was put in our constitution as well, so that states like Queensland and Western Australia, who refused to give voting rights to Aboriginal people, they couldn't count them in the census, so they couldn't get extra seats in the parliament. That was removed. The other things that were changed was that the Commonwealth government could not make laws about Aboriginals, so then they changed that to make laws about all races. And so that was the other big change. But the big thing about it was in regard to this. These two photos. Give us equal rights throughout Australia. It was about equality. It was about getting rid of the race laws. It was about giving us equality and moving ahead as people. And so what happened within 4 years of that constitutional change, all the race laws in Australia disappeared. 4 or 5 years. There's no more race laws. In fact, things changed that, the Gorton government introduced AB studies so that it helped Aboriginals get to school and helped Aboriginals go to universities. There was Malcolm Fraser with the land rights legislation and that. There was this progression from that 67 referendum to full equality and be treated as full citizens of this country, and to and get the opportunities and the pleasures and everything that every other citizen of Australia got. In fact, within 4 years we had the first Aboriginal go into Parliament, and that was Senator Neville Bonner from Queensland. And then within 2 years after that, there was Eric Durrell, who was elected, who was a Queensland Aboriginal, elected to the Queensland Parliament in 1974. Within the same year, Hyacinth Tungalamu was elected in the Northern Territory Parliament as the first Aboriginal there. So we had all these people starting to get into parliaments and things happening. Aboriginal medical services were set up, Aboriginal health services, Aboriginal legal services. So we had this incredible movement to get things moving forward in that. That didn't say that things weren't still bad in parts of Australia. In fact, you look at some of the areas in it. But one of the things that because when I went to the South Australian Institute of Technology, I studied business and that, I saw that one of the major things that lift people out of poverty, and it's over 500, 600 years of study, it was economic development, it was jobs, it was getting kids to school and educated, it was setting up businesses which were profitable and commercial, and that work and investment into Aboriginal communities. So that's what I worked on a lot, even though I was in other areas as well. I chaired the panel for reduction of reoffending in South Australia. Malinarka's got me to do that. I did the chair of the Indigenous Child Abuse in New South Wales. I chaired that for Peru Gao. I did the Juvenile Crime Prevention Committee, and I also worked with Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull on the Indigenous Advisory Council. From the Advisory Council, we come up with some, really positive pushing areas that would make a difference. And one of the examples we did, we set up the business economic strategy. That strategy in 2015, the 1st of July of 2015, was $6.2 million it was worth in contract. It had to be done on merit. It hardly cost the government a penny because they were doing contract, had to have stationery, they had to have, you know, pens and tanks and everything else. As of a few weeks ago, that is now worth $8.7 billion, that industry. 45,434 Aboriginal jobs were created. 3,619 businesses were created. We had the annual turnover in regard to the government's spend in contracts, and that is $4.9 billion. To me, this is the way to move forward. The mining industry has $3.5 billion invested into Aboriginal communities, and that's gone up to $5.6 billion in the recent years, in the creation of 7,000 jobs. To me, it's about, these are the things that make difference in lives. These are the things that make practical changes in life. And these are the things that will make life better for Indigenous people, like it happened to me with my family. My kids grew up thinking it was normal that you get educated and you run a business. I have 10 kids. I blame the nuns for that. And mate, I could tell you some funny stories about my Catholic education, you know, especially. Okay, so I'll finish up by saying these are the things that make differences. We're on this journey of improving people's lives and doing things. You can ask me questions and everything later that I'll talk about some of these experiences in the child abuse areas and the deaths in custody and many other things. But I'll finish off by saying just about every country in the world's had a bad beginning. I don't judge a nation by the worst of its history, but I judge it by how it overcomes the worst of its history and by its vision for the now and the future. And on that measure, I judge Australia well. You know, people talk about the 11 people in Parliament. There's actually 28 across Australia at state and territory levels. That number, I predict, will be over 50 over the next couple of elections. I'm a chairman of a mining company, and that mining company, they cannot do anything on the mine, not even build a toilet, without consulting, negotiating and coming to agreement with Aboriginal people, the traditional owners of that land. To me, that is a voice. And my old ex-boss, Twiggy Forrest, found that out pretty strongly a few weeks ago when the traditional owners refused to give him an irrigation licence for a river. To me, that is a voice. So that we're heading in the right directions. I'm not, as I said, I was a supporter of the voice up until about 2016 and now I see it as a huge bureaucracy that is another layer over the top of those traditional owners. The traditional owners are the ones who can speak for country, and they're the only ones who can speak for country. Thank you.